The challenge of modernity, when properly scrutinized, is to live in an environment that oftentimes bears little to no resemblance to the environment that had given birth to our species. Adaptations, whatever their nature and origin, have always evolved as a response to specific selection pressures that our ancestors had faced in the past. Modern anatomical Homo sapiens has been around between 200 and 100,000 years, and this does not even take into account the millions of years of hominid evolution that had taken place prior to modern man's inception, all of which had set important benchmarks for modern man's development. And man himself, like all animals, developed in a continuous feedback loop of environmental challenges leading to biologically based adaptive change, rendering him more capable of surviving and passing on his genes. But the modern world of towering skyscrapers, office buildings, and traffic, and a seeming never-ending array of ever more novel gadgets, as well as the demands of work that reflect this bizarre environment we have forged for ourselves, often does not mesh well with our physiology as apes hailing from the plains of Africa. Technological evolution has vastly outpaced our biological evolution, and we are paying a high price for it in a range of ways. In the past, I have spoken of maladaptive behavior in the context of intersexual conflict and interaction, the continuously changing landscape of modernity and mating rituals harking back to bygone times, powered by our biology and respective reproductive concerns. These things are well known by now. The perilous relationship between the state and the female acting upon environmental incentives, as well as the phenomenon of MGTOW, which is essentially men responding to environmental disincentives. All of this has been well documented. However, one need not assume that maladaptive behavior is merely limited to gender-specific domains or reproduction. Increasingly, we are running into cognitive maladaptation applicable to all humans on a scale hitherto unknown because of information overload. This cognitive maladaptation, which is often referred to as a skill, is supposedly required for job efficiency, and indeed one allegedly required for all aspects of modern life. We call it multitasking. What most people do not know or realize, however, particularly those who might think of themselves as skilled practitioners of multitasking, is that human beings are not wired as a species to be effective at multitasking. Multitasking, of course, can encompass a wide range of activities, from reading memos while simultaneously checking email, watching films and texting at the same time, driving a car and texting and or talking on the phone intermittently. And because of the information age we live in, there seems to be an almost incessant demand and requirement for this. But humans did not evolve to perform multitasks effectively. For years now, study after study has shown that despite people's bold claims of being effective multitaskers, when paired up against people focusing on a single task, so-called multitaskers always lose and perform less efficiently than their single-task counterparts. To quote from a relevant article, quote, "In one of the many letters he wrote to his son in the 1740s, Lord Chesterfield offered the following advice. There is time enough for everything in the course of the day, if you do but one thing at once. But there is not time enough in the year, if you will do two things at a time." To Chesterfield, singular focus was not merely a practical way to structure one's time. It was a mark of intelligence. This steady and undisputed attention to one object is a sure mark of superior genius, as hurry, bustle, and agitation are the never-failing symptoms of a weak and frivolous mind. This would almost seem common sense, but this advice is regularly and routinely defied and ignored in our day. A Stanford study conducted several years ago yielded interesting results, with the researchers beginning with the hypothesis of what made multitaskers better than non-multitaskers, with the somewhat surprising result that the so-called multitaskers were not better at anything. Quote, "We kept looking for what they're better at, and we didn't find it," says Ophir, the study's lead author and a researcher in Stanford's Communication Between Humans and Interactive Media Lab. In each of their tests, the researchers split their subjects into two groups, those who regularly do a lot of media multitasking and those who don't. In one experiment, the groups were shown sets of 2 red rectangles alone or surrounded by 2, 4, or 6 blue rectangles. Each configuration was flashed twice, and the participants had to determine whether the 2 red rectangles in the second frame were in a different position than in the first frame. They were told to ignore the blue rectangles, and the low multitaskers had no problem doing that, but the high multitaskers were constantly distracted by the irrelevant blue images. Their performance was horrible. Because the high multitaskers showed that they couldn't ignore things, the researchers figured they were better at storing and organizing information. Maybe they had better memories. The second test proved that theory wrong. After being shown sequences of alphabetical letters, the high multitaskers did a lousy job at remembering when a letter was making a repeat appearance. The low multitaskers did great, Ophir said. The high multitaskers were doing worse and worse the further they went along because they kept on seeing more letters and had difficulty keeping them sorted in their brains. Puzzled, but not yet stumped on why the heavy multitaskers weren't performing well, the researchers conducted a third test. If the heavy multitaskers couldn't filter out irrelevant information or organize their memories, perhaps they excelled at switching from one thing to another faster and better than anyone else. Wrong again, the study found. The test subjects were shown images of letters and numbers at the same time and instructed what to focus on. When they were told to pay attention to numbers, they had to determine if the digits were even or odd. When told to concentrate on letters, they had to say whether they were vowels or consonants. Again, the heavy multitaskers underperformed the light multitaskers. They couldn't help thinking about the task they weren't doing, Ophir said. The high multitaskers are always drawing from all information in front of them. They can't keep things separate in their minds. The researchers are still studying whether chronic media multitaskers are born with an inability to concentrate or are damaging their cognitive control by willingly taking in so much at once, but they're convinced the minds of multitaskers are not working as well as they could. Yet another study at the University of London showed that multitasking actually temporarily lowers multitaskers' IQ. Quote, research also shows that in addition to slowing you down, multitasking lowers your IQ. A study at the University of London found that participants who multitasked during cognitive tasks experienced IQ score declines that were similar to what they'd expect if they'd smoked marijuana or stayed up all night. IQ drops of 15 points for multitasking men lowered their scores to the average range of an 8-year-old child. And finally, in a study at the University of Sussex, it was found that multitasking may induce brain damage. Quote, it was long believed that cognitive impairment from multitasking was temporary, but new research suggests otherwise. Researchers at the University of Sussex in the UK compared the amount of time people spent on multiple devices, such as texting while watching television, to MRI scans of their brains. They found that the high multitaskers had less brain density in the anterior cingulate cortex, a region responsible for empathy as well as cognitive and emotional control. The jury is no longer out on the issue of multitasking as being effective, since numerous studies have pointed to the fact that we humans simply cannot do it very well, and it has been shown to be, at the very least, mildly damaging in the case of temporary IQ loss and performance loss, and perhaps even more severely damaging in the case of brain damage, which of course requires further study. The data are conclusive, but the data and the results of studies do not tell us how we wound up in this current mess. Technological development and, after a fashion, cultural evolution have been sped up enormously in the previous century, and still more in our current one. In the past, I'd used the term mechanization effect, primarily in the context and the manner which these developments have shaped gender interactions at a society-wide level. There cannot be any doubt, though, that at the physiological level, the mechanization effect has also had profound influence on our health and physiology, perhaps even more so than it has had for social behavior. One of the most easily demonstrable and well-known examples of this is that of caloric surplus and food composition. Food and nutrients in hunter-gatherer times were not easily obtainable and had to be sought after with intent and planning. In today's environment, they're around every corner and in every street, calorically dense, high-fat and high-sugar foods that, to top it off, have little nutritional value, and they're available everywhere. And this combined with a lack of movement, or more appropriately put, diminished caloric expenditure is a major cause of being overweight and obesity. We'd evolved to enjoy the taste of sugar and fat and the energy they offered because having a taste for such foods lent itself to survival in a resource-scarce environment where calories were constantly being expended to merely make it through the day. Modernity, or the mechanization effect, has flipped this mechanism on its head, and what were once survival tools are now new means towards illness and eventual death. I mention this to illustrate a point that is more easily observed than other less transparent physiological maladaptations. And from this vantage point, we must consider why we are not good at multitasking and why it might be damaging to us in the long run from the perspective of evolution and previous adaptations to a specific kind of environment. One thing we can take note of rather quickly, even without knowing every specific aspect of our ancestral environment, is that the amount of distractions and information input was far, far less than that of today. 30,000 years ago, there were no cars, airplanes, traffic, mobile devices, computers, or artificial illumination. Comparatively, there was little distraction. People focused on specific tasks in a singular fashion. To track and hunt an animal required that all focus be delegated to said task, as was the case with building a fire, crafting a spearhead, or building shelter, one thing at a time. We know this because it can be understood by both inductive means and abductive means. If modern humans in the year 2015 can neither multitask and additionally are damaged by attempting it, then it follows that there has never been an evolutionary precedent for it in our lineage, and coupled with the amount of sheer distractions that exist in our era compared to those of tens of thousands of years ago, there exists further evidence to support the idea that we not only cannot process too much at once, but that the information overload society we live in is actually harmful to us. Yet at the same time, it often seems to us that we are in fact multitasking when engaged in multiple activities such as answering a correspondence, taking a phone call, and taking down notes, a group of activities that, when performed simultaneously, would almost certainly be referred to as multitasking. But in reality, what is happening is the rapid switching and rotation of attention to each specific task, not a concentration on all tasks simultaneously. In the example above, all three tasks involve linguistic cognition, and thus each task requires a certain amount of concentration in order for it to be performed properly. When there are too many similar tasks demanding the same thing of the respective region of the brain, one gets a kind of brain competition, and if one cannot rotate through the task quickly enough, the overall ability to focus and concentrate is diminished, and you get the type of multitasking failure and burnout described previously in the studies. Our ability to sometimes rapidly switch from task to task only appears to be multitasking, but in reality is just that, switching and rotating, not simultaneous execution of multiple tasks, and those who believe they are effective at multitasking, which is code for information overload, are deluding themselves. All this falls within the category of executive functions of the brain, the scope of which extends beyond this video. However, these executive functions encompass management and regulation of cognitive processes. The frontal lobe is the primary executor region in matters involving the kinds of tasks that are associated with multitasking typically, and also the one that limits us in terms of how much we can do and absorb at any given time. The human frontal lobe is far more developed than that of other animals, and has essentially allowed for the rise of human civilization. But at the same time, it can convince us and delude us into believing things that are not true, such as being efficient multitaskers. The irony is perhaps that without our robust frontal lobes, we could not have erected the information overload civilization we have today. But it is that very civilization, coupled with the mechanization effect, that is diminishing our quality of life and health. In a nigh perfectly ironic feat of cognitive dissonance, the tool which gave rise to everything we know today is also damaging us as we strive to keep up with the informational dimension we were never intended to keep up with, all due to very real biological limitations. Something else that correlates with and is often a byproduct of our information overload society is stress. Almost everyone is familiar with it, but few take the time to understand its etiology, either in terms of evolution or its biochemistry, which, after doing so, gives us the tools for avoiding and combating it. Stress in the ancestral environment was an environmentally adaptive fight or flight chemical reaction to temporary circumstances. Imagine being approached and threatened by a cave lion in Europe some 30,000 years ago, where the only choices available are to flee or be killed and possibly be eaten. When encountering this threatening animal, the body is put under duress, and a chemical reaction takes place. Cortisol is released from the adrenal glands in order to facilitate a fight or flight mechanism. Cortisol is a steroid hormone that controls a number of bodily functions, including regulation of fat, protein, and carbohydrate metabolism, specifically the process known as gluconeogenesis, which is the conversion of certain amino acids to glucose, anti-inflammatory function, central nervous system activation, as well as other vital functions related to heart and blood vessel contraction. This steroid hormone is an absolute necessity, and it is a life-saving hormone that serves to regulate some of the body's most important functions during times of duress. However, after that period of duress is over, cortisol levels usually return to normal and its interference stops. But this only occurs assuming such stressful encounters only last a short while. And given the cave lion scenario, they almost certainly did, with flight or death being the only possible outcomes. But when we transpose our physiology to the modern world, we begin to encounter problems. In the tens of thousands of years since the cave lion encounter, man has changed little in his hormonal regulatory system, which means stress and duress still promote the appropriate cortisol release, with one key difference. In the modern, mechanized world, we are inundated with constant stress, which could be likened to having to deal with a cave lion encounter 18 hours a day. And even then, it does not end, as the problems in your head that are troubling you continue to plague you, and you bring them home with you. And this brings about a physiological response in the form of cortisol production that is of far greater duration than is healthy. Like many hormones, cortisol is a double-edged sword, one edge of which is vital to survival in short-term stressful situations, with the other edge being a slow but deliberate killer. Constantly elevated cortisol levels lead to a litany of health problems, including, but not limited to, insomnia, immune system deficiency, coronary problems, loss of muscle, elevated blood pressure, and concentration problems, some of which can potentially lead to health problems, and even death. And in the modern world, people have become cortisol machines, pumping it out round the clock. Its adaptive value and application have become maladaptive, and this is extremely important to underscore. Physiological adaptations are very specific and occur in a specific and specified context, where a deviation from that context can lead to unpredictable and even disastrous outcomes in some cases. If we combine the modern phenomena of multitasking and stress, we get a recipe for a host of health problems and premature death. The problem is, as is often the case, we have made tremendous progress in the last few centuries, but without the wisdom and foresight of reflecting on how that progress might affect us. This is true of primarily behavioral phenomena, such as gender interaction, but even more so of physiological responses to stimuli. Civilization itself, in some manner or form, has become a double-edged sword, and despite claims that I speak of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, I have always advocated for knowledge with application. If we understand how it is we work, be it on the behavioral level or the purely physiological level, we can take measures to limit or outright halt the kinds of things that contribute to the degradation of our health, both mental and physical. If we know that humans cannot cope with too much information, we should do our best to adjust our work and lives such that we do not end up in situations that resemble conventional multitasking. If we know how stress response works and of its origin, we can take measures to avoid it, or if that is not entirely possible, counter it with necessary measures such as sport, leisure, and meditation. This is particularly true from a MGTOW perspective. Knowledge is essential to MGTOW, but not for its own sake. Rather, it is important for the benefits of its application. Understanding our human origins, as well as our deficits, and how we engage in maladaptive behavior have created a maladaptive environment that wreaks havoc on our physiology, allows us to better navigate an increasingly mind-jarring and mechanized world that is inhabited by what is still essentially an ill-prepared ape from the Pleistocene. The difference is essentially that of being lost at sea adrift in a storm without a vessel, blindly hoping to find dry land and shelter, or having a strong and seaworthy ship equipped with all the necessary navigation tools, charting a well-specified course. The former is a death sentence, whilst the latter will allow us to brave the storm and reach our destination, and eventually prosperity. Thanks for watching. As is usually the case, if you're interested in reading up more on the subject matters I just covered, links from the low bar, check them out. And once again, thanks for watching and take care. Bye-bye.